They handed him a list of names. Not enemies on a battlefield. Not rebel commanders in the bush. These were officials inside his own government. Advisors, ministers, people with direct access to the president's office, the treasury, the military command structure. The kind of people who shape policy before it's ever announced. And according to the intelligence briefing sitting in front of Ibrahim Traore, some of them weren't working for Burkina Faso at all. This wasn't a coup in the traditional sense. There were no troops massing at the presidential palace. No tanks rolling through Ouagadougou at dawn. But what was unfolding inside Burkina Faso's institutions was, in many ways, more dangerous. Because this was the kind of takeover that doesn't announce itself. The kind that happens in meeting rooms, through encrypted messages, in quiet conversations with foreign representatives who offer support that comes with strings attached. The kind where a nation loses its sovereignty without ever realizing it's been captured. And Traoré had a choice to make. He could have done what many leaders do when handed a list like this: launch arrests, make public accusations, purge the government in a dramatic show of force. It would have been fast. It would have been visible. And it would have been a disaster. Because the moment you start arresting people based on a leaked list, you create martyrs. You trigger panic. You give the network exactly what it needs: chaos, confusion, and a narrative that paints the president as paranoid, authoritarian, unstable. You turn suspicion into spectacle, and spectacle into political crisis. Traoré didn't take the bait. Instead, he did something far more methodical. He turned the suspected network into an intelligence operation. He decided to watch, to test, to trace the threads until the evidence wasn't just a list of names, but a documented chain of coordination, influence, and foreign entanglement that could not be denied. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing a system that had embedded itself so deeply into Burkina Faso's government that removing it required precision, not performance. Because what Traoré understood, and what makes this case so significant across the African continent, is that modern coups don't look like coups anymore. They look like partnerships. They look like technical assistance. They look like friendly nations offering expertise, funding, policy frameworks that just happen to align with their own strategic interests. And by the time a country realizes it's not being helped but steered, the infrastructure of influence is already locked in place. So how do you dismantle something like that without tearing your own government apart? You start by changing the rules of the game. Traoré's team began planting what intelligence professionals call controlled policy baits. These were deliberate, traceable variations in policy discussions. Slightly different versions of the same proposal introduced in different rooms, to different groups of officials. The kind of subtle shifts that wouldn't be noticed unless someone was paying very close attention, or unless they were reporting back to someone outside the room. And that's exactly what started happening. Certain policy positions that were only shared in specific meetings began appearing in external communications. Recommendations that hadn't been finalized were suddenly being echoed by foreign diplomats and international partners before they'd even been officially discussed. It wasn't coincidence. It was coordination. And it revealed something critical. There were channels operating inside the government that bypassed official structures entirely. Shadow advisory pathways where decisions were being shaped, influenced, and in some cases preempted by actors who had no formal authority, but significant reach. This is where the stakes become clear. Because what Traoré was uncovering wasn't just a few corrupt officials taking bribes. It was a network designed to capture the decision-making process itself, to ensure that no matter who sat in the president's chair, the real direction of the country would be set elsewhere. It's the kind of institutional coup that doesn't need to overthrow a government because it's already inside it. And the fingerprints pointed back to a familiar source. France has a long documented history of maintaining influence across its former colonies in West Africa. That influence has traditionally operated through a combination of military presence, economic agreements, currency control via the CFA franc, and embedded advisory structures within governments. Officially, these arrangements are framed as partnership, stability, continuity. Unofficially, They've allowed Paris to maintain strategic leverage over some of the continent's most resource-rich nations for more than 6 decades. Burkina Faso, like many of its neighbors, has lived within this system since independence. And for much of that time, the system worked quietly, without widespread resistance. But the last few years have changed the equation. A wave of military-led governments has swept across the Sahel, from Mali to Niger to Burkina Faso itself. And one of the unifying threads across these transitions has been a rejection of traditional French influence. Traoré came to power in 2022 as part of this broader shift. And from the beginning, his administration signaled that it would not operate under the old rules. French troops were asked to leave. Security partnerships were reoriented toward Russia. Economic agreements were scrutinized and, in some cases, renegotiated. This wasn't symbolic. It was structural. And it made Burkina Faso a target for the kind of influence operations that don't announce themselves, but work from within. So when Traoré's intelligence team began tracing financial flows, what they found wasn't surprising. It was confirming. Money was moving in patterns that didn't align with official government budgets or declared partnerships. Payments were being routed through third-party consultancies, NGOs, and advisory firms with opaque ownership structures. Some of these entities had direct or indirect links to French interests. Others were harder to trace, but operated in ways that suggested external coordination. The key wasn't just that money was flowing, it was how it was being used. To fund specific voices, to amplify certain narratives, to ensure that even as Burkina Faso's government publicly moved away from French influence, there were still nodes inside the system pushing back, quietly lobbying for policies that would preserve elements of the old relationship. And then there was the messaging. Traoré's team noticed something else. Certain critiques of government policy, specific wording, specific framing, were appearing almost simultaneously across multiple platforms. Opinion pieces in regional media, social media accounts, statements from civil society groups, all using remarkably similar language to question the same decisions at the same time. On the surface, this could look like organic public debate. But when you map the timing, the funding sources, and the coordination behind it, a different picture emerges. This was synchronized messaging. And it wasn't coming from genuine grassroots opposition. It was being orchestrated. What happens next could redefine the region. Because Traoré didn't just uncover a network, he dismantled it. And he did it without turning it into a public spectacle. No dramatic arrests broadcast on state television. No purges that would have triggered international condemnation and claims of authoritarianism. Instead, the response was administrative, surgical, quiet. Access was restricted. Officials who had been identified as nodes in the network found themselves reassigned, sidelined, or removed from sensitive positions through routine bureaucratic processes that didn't require public justification. Advisory contracts were allowed to expire without renewal. Shadow channels were closed by restructuring decision-making protocols so that policy discussions flowed through fewer, more controlled pathways. Financial containment measures were put in place, cutting off the funding streams that had sustained the influence operation. And throughout all of this, the government maintained a public posture of normalcy. No accusations, no conspiracy theories, just a steady, methodical erasure of the infrastructure that had been built to steer Burkina Faso from the shadows. This approach carries risk. By not making the operation public, Traoré denied himself the political capital that comes with exposing foreign interference. He couldn't rally nationalist sentiment or use the revelations to consolidate power through a visible confrontation with external enemies. But he also avoided the traps. He didn't create martyrs. He didn't give the network a narrative to weaponize. He didn't trigger the kind of instability that foreign powers could exploit to justify intervention or sanctions. He chose effectiveness over visibility. And in doing so, he demonstrated a level of strategic patience that's rare in modern African politics. But the implications go far beyond Burkina Faso. Because what Traoré exposed is a model of interference that's being deployed across the continent. The days of overt colonial control are over. The days of military coups backed by foreign powers, at least in the traditional visible sense, are mostly behind us. But the tactics have evolved. Today's interference doesn't require tanks. It requires influence. It requires embedding operatives, advisors, and proxies inside the institutions that matter. It requires controlling the flow of information, shaping the policy debate, and ensuring that even when a government changes, the underlying direction remains aligned with external interests. And it's working. Across Africa, there are governments that believe they're making sovereign decisions while operating within frameworks designed abroad. There are leaders who think they're negotiating partnerships while being maneuvered into dependency. There are nations that have formal independence but functional subordination, maintained not through occupation, but through advisory capture, financial leverage, and coordinated pressure that operates just below the threshold of visibility. This is the modern coup, and it's harder to resist than the old kind because it doesn't look like an attack. It looks like help. Traoré's response matters because it shows that resistance is possible, that a government can identify these networks, trace their operations, and dismantle them without descending into paranoia or authoritarianism. But it also reveals how sophisticated the challenge has become, because the network Traoré uncovered wasn't a rogue operation. It wasn't a few corrupt individuals acting on their own. It was a coordinated system, backed by resources, expertise, and institutional knowledge that comes from decades of practice. And Burkina Faso is just one country. The same tactics are likely being deployed in capitals across the region, adapted to local contexts, embedded in different institutions, but operating with the same fundamental goal: to ensure that African nations remain strategically aligned with external powers even as they pursue formal independence. So what does this mean for the future? First, it means that sovereignty is no longer just about military defense or border control. It's about institutional integrity. It's about ensuring that the people making decisions inside your government are actually working for your national interest, not serving as nodes in someone else's strategic network. And that requires a level of counterintelligence capacity that many African governments simply don't have. Traoré had the advantage of coming to power through a military transition, which gave him the security apparatus and the political space to conduct this kind of operation. But in countries with more fragmented political systems, where civil society is stronger, where the media is more independent, the same approach might not be possible, which means the networks can operate with less resistance. Second, it raises questions about the broader geopolitical realignment happening across the Sahel. Traoré's government, like those in Mali and Niger, has shifted away from France and toward Russia. But Russia brings its own forms of influence, its own advisory networks, its own economic and security entanglements. The risk isn't just that Burkina Faso replaces one external patron with another. The risk is that it trades one form of capture for a different version of the same dynamic. And if that happens, the cycle continues. Different flags, different languages, same loss of sovereignty. Third, it signals that the fight for African independence isn't over. It's just moved into a different arena. The liberation struggles of the 20th century were fought with guns and guerrilla movements. The sovereignty struggles of the 21st century are being fought in cabinet rooms, in financial systems, in media ecosystems, and in the invisible infrastructure of influence that shapes who gets to make decisions and whose interests those decisions serve. And most of the continent isn't even aware it's happening. Is this a strategic breakthrough or the start of a larger pattern? Because if other African leaders are paying attention, Traoré just provided a blueprint, not for paranoia, not for witch hunts, but for methodical evidence-based identification and neutralization of foreign influence networks operating inside their own governments. And if that blueprint spreads, if more countries start applying the same level of scrutiny to the advisory structures, funding channels, and coordination mechanisms that have been normalized over decades, the geopolitical map of Africa could shift in ways that aren't yet visible, but are already in motion. But there's a counterpoint. Traoré succeeded because he had the intelligence capacity, the political will, and the institutional control to pull it off. Most African governments don't have all three. And the networks he dismantled aren't going to disappear. They'll adapt. They'll find new entry points. They'll embed themselves in different institutions, use different channels, recruit different proxies. Because the strategic value of maintaining influence over resource-rich, geopolitically significant African nations hasn't changed. And as long as that value exists, the tactics to secure it will continue to evolve. So the question isn't whether foreign powers will keep trying to steer African governments from the shadows. They will. The question is whether African governments will develop the capacity to detect, expose, and dismantle those efforts without destroying their own institutions in the process. And that's the real test. Because Traoré's approach worked in part because it was quiet. But silence has a cost. The Burkinabe public doesn't know what was uncovered. The network's backers weren't publicly shamed or held accountable. The international community didn't face consequences for enabling or tolerating this kind of interference. And without visibility, without accountability, the incentive structure remains unchanged. The next network will try again, maybe in Burkina Faso, maybe in the next country, maybe with slightly different tactics, but the same fundamental goal. This is the paradox of modern sovereignty. To defend it effectively, you sometimes have to operate in the shadows. But operating in the shadows means the public doesn't see the threat, doesn't understand the stakes, and doesn't develop the political consciousness needed to resist future attempts. And so the cycle continues, hidden from view, fought in silence, with only a few people in a few rooms even aware that the battle is happening. Traoré chose discretion over exposure, effectiveness over spectacle. And in the short term, it worked. The network was dismantled. The coup infrastructure was neutralized. Burkina Faso retained control over its own decision-making process, at least for now. But the long-term question remains unanswered. Because the forces that built that network are still out there. The interests that funded it haven't changed. The strategic imperative to maintain influence over African governments hasn't disappeared. And the next time, they'll be more careful. They'll learn from what went wrong in Burkina Faso. They'll build more redundancy into their networks. They'll diversify their channels, obscure their funding, recruit more carefully, and operate with even greater subtlety. Because that's how these systems evolve. Every exposure makes them harder to detect. Every dismantling makes them more resilient. And unless African governments build the capacity to stay ahead of that evolution, they'll always be one step behind. So what Ibrahim Traore uncovered in Burkina Faso isn't just a story about one country resisting one network. It's a preview of the kind of struggle that will define African geopolitics for the next generation. A struggle that won't be fought on battlefields, but in institutions. A struggle that won't produce dramatic headlines, but will determine who actually controls the future of the continent. A struggle that most people will never see, but will shape their lives in ways they'll never fully understand. And the outcome is far from certain. Because for every Traoré who has the awareness and the capacity to fight back, there are dozens of governments that don't. For every network that gets dismantled, there are others that remain undetected, still steering, still influencing, still capturing. And for every moment of resistance, there's a counter-strategy already being developed, already being deployed, already working its way into the next set of institutions. This is the reality of sovereignty in the modern era. It's not a declaration. It's not a constitution. It's a constant, invisible, exhausting battle to ensure that the people making decisions in your name are actually working for you. And most of the time, you won't even know the battle is happening until it's already lost. Traoré won this round, but the war is far from over. And the question that should keep every African leader awake at night is this: how many networks are operating inside their own governments right now that they don't even know exist? How many decisions are being shaped by interests that were never elected, never appointed, never accountable to the people supposedly being served? How much of what looks like national policy is actually external strategy, laundered through local proxies and presented as domestic consensus? Burkina Faso just proved that these networks can be found. They can be traced. They can be dismantled. But it also proved how difficult that process is. how much capacity it requires, and how rare it is for all the necessary conditions to align. Which means that for every success story, there are likely dozens of countries where the same thing is happening and no one is stopping it. And that's the real coup. Not the one that failed in Burkina Faso, but the one still running, undetected, across the rest of the continent.